in a world of converging global crises, from the cost of living crisis to energy price volatility to societal polarization. Earlier, I spoke with the World Economic Forum Managing Director Saadia Zahidi on her latest Global Risks 2023 report and how blockchain and other technologies could potentially solve or present further risks to these problems. Have a listen.
So we launched this report last week as a sort of curtain raiser or a backdrop to this meeting, essentially so that we could focus the conversations here on what are the short-term challenges, what are the long-term challenges. And we looked at 3 time frames. We first started looking at year zero, 2023, what are the key issues facing us today, 2 years out by 2025, and then 10 years out by 2033. Right now, front and center, energy crisis, food crisis. That is very much top of leaders' minds. 2 years out, it's actually still the cost of living that is likely to be the biggest sort of global risk because of the repercussions on societies. But quickly following that are natural disasters and all of the sort of climate change that we're already starting to see. And 10 years out, it's all about, do we succeed or not in terms of climate mitigation and climate adaptation? So that's roughly what the next decade and its concerns look like.
So what is the sentiment like in trying to tackle these issues?
So it's very clear that we are already in the midst of a polycrisis, and if we don't immediately act to boost resilience, to get economies and societies stable again, if there were to be another shock, it would be almost unmanageable. And so that's where the focus is here.
In terms of solutions, are there real solutions being discussed, and what are they? What immediate action or, what action can be built so that we can actually combat these?
Yeah, so policymakers are already very much focused on providing support to those that are most disadvantaged in the midst of this cost of living crisis. There's already been effort to try to secure energy supplies, for example, in Europe. But more needs to be done, right? So the technologies that will help us grow faster and better in the future, they already exist. We need to apply those basic technologies to agriculture and innovation in food. We need to apply those to education, need to apply that to digital trade, to health, to care. That's how our economies get back on a surer footing, and that's how we get to a future in which living standards get raised for everybody.
In terms of technologies, do you see cryptocurrencies helping or even causing risks to the system?
Interestingly, we asked 50 chief economists around the world from various sectors, various institutions, whether they saw a risk of the downturn in crypto spilling over into other sectors. And actually, they rate that extremely low in terms of the risks. I think it's much more about how do we ensure that we deploy all of these new technologies for greater good so that it doesn't remain something that's niche in one particular sector, but rather something that's available to everybody.
In terms of technologies, how can technology help?
So I think it really depends on what you're talking about, right? So we're facing a food crisis at the moment, and a lot of that has to do with the war in Ukraine. A lot of that has to do with overall supply chain issues that existed because of the pandemic. But we also know that pretty basic technologies that already exist can help improve crop yields, for example. That's where the application needs to go. And some of the developing and emerging markets is where those technologies need to be applied. So how does that work? Governments need to put some of that in place themselves. They need to use their
tracking supply management,
fiscal firepower, indeed. Right. And then the other element is they need to incentivize the private sector to invest in those technologies in some of these basic core sectors that matter for humanity. And so some of that is indeed about tracking, but a lot of that is also about policy making and incentives.
What about in terms of the climate, what immediate solutions can be done to mitigate climate change?
Yeah, so one of the things that has already started happening because of the energy crisis, in particular in Europe, is that governments are moving much faster to put in place the right kinds of incentives for the energy transition to happen. Now, the downside of that is that it will likely keep energy prices quite high for some time to come. So while those incentives are being put in place, while those investments are happening, we also need to make sure that people have basic support on energy and not having to make sort of terrible choices between, heating and eating. So there has to be a lot more support given to specific people that are disadvantaged. And the other element is innovation in the energy sector, right? So we've already seen in the last couple of years the developments that have taken place that have, for example, greatly made cheaper solar energy, or at least made the potential for future solar energy to be much cheaper than it currently is. That kind of investment, that kind of innovation is what's needed. At the same time, I think we can't assume that we're going to be out of the woods just through climate mitigation measures alone. It's become very clear that adaptation to a changing climate has to be part of what governments invest in the next 10 years.
I saw another big risk was the war between Ukraine and Russia. In terms of the delegations here, how has that come together?
You know, we're going to have presence from Ukraine, but we will also have presence from all of the economies that are impacted by this. And that isn't just in Europe. That's also countries around the world that have traditionally, in the Middle East and Africa, that have traditionally relied, for example, on grain imports from Ukraine that are now being greatly affected, and energy imports from around the world and are greatly affected by this crisis. So this matters to more people than in Europe, and this matters to a much wider global society. And I think it's also a reminder that we need to be focusing much more on cooperation, and conflicts and crises is not what's going to get us out of those longer term crises and longer term risks.
Any diplomatic talks assisting in reaching some sort of cooperation?
We'll be having lots of discussion around restoring trade. We'll be having discussion around technology cooperation. We'll be having a lot of discussion around restoring cooperation around climate. So this meeting is all about getting past the fragmentation, getting past some of the conflicts, and actually focusing on where we can find areas for cooperation.
I guess finally, I just want to touch on some of the short-term concerns, which is high inflation, combating those concerns, rising consumer prices.
Yeah. With all of the efforts that central banks around the world have put in place, it's very clear that we're in for an era with higher interest rates. We're in for an era where inflation at the same time will not quite go down as fast as central banks were hoping for. And so this will be a turbulent time where, on the one hand, we'll have high inflation, we'll also have higher interest rates. I think policymakers have so far struck a balance, and it remains to be seen. Do we head into a global recession? Does it end up being a fairly mild one? Or do we essentially have low growth for some time? The forecasts that we have out from our chief economists today, 2/3 of them predict a mild but a global recession. Now, that's not to say that that is set for the future. Predictions are only that. They are forecasts based on what we know today. So if governments now put in place more coordination efforts, there's no reason that we have to be going into a recession.